Vaughn had spent 5 years turning himself into a ghost. That was the only way a man with his history could survive the silence of the high country. No drifters looking for a reputation, no lawmen looking for a bounty, and no ghosts from his past asking why he was the one who got to live. Just him, the timberline, and the heavy winter silence. But on this particular morning, the silence was broken not by the wind, but by the crunch of hooves on fresh powder. It was Christmas Eve, though Vaughn had nearly forgotten the date until he'd seen the frost patterns on the glass that morning. He stepped out onto his porch, his hand instinctively hovering near the Colt Navy revolver he still wore out of habit, though he hadn't fired it in anger since the war. The snow was falling in thick, lazy flakes, blanketing the valley in white, but the figure sitting on the horse 50 yards away was a splash of stark contrast. She was motionless, watching him with an intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up. She wasn't a local settler, and she certainly wasn't a lost traveler. She wore a high-collared, traditional cheongsam made of heavy gray silk, padded against the cold, with fur lining the edges. It was a garment of elegance and tradition, utterly out of place in the rugged Wyoming wilderness. She sat her horse with the poise of royalty, her dark eyes tracking Vaughn as he stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into the drift. Vaughn didn't speak. He just watched her, waiting for the trouble he assumed she brought. She nudged her horse forward, the animal parting the snow with its chest, until she stopped 10 feet from him. Up close, he saw the sharpness of her features, the calculated intelligence in her gaze. She looked at his gun belt, then up to his eyes, measuring him. "You live alone," she said. Her voice was unaccented, clear and crisp as the winter air. "You act as if you are dead to the world. You hold a weapon you clearly know how to use. Yet the townspeople say you walked away from a fight in the saloon last month without drawing it." Vaughn frowned, the cold biting at his cheeks. "I don't look for trouble, ma'am. If you're looking for a hired gun, you've got the wrong cabin." "I am not looking for a hired gun," she interrupted, her tone flat and serious. "I am looking for a father. I want an heir from you." The words hung in the freezing air, absurd and heavy. Vaughn stared at her, certain he had misheard. "You want a what?" "An heir. A child." She didn't blink, didn't blush. She spoke as if she were negotiating a land deed. "I have watched you for 3 days. You are disciplined. You do not drink yourself into a stupor like the men in town. You move with economy. And most importantly, you possess violence, but you choose not to use it. That is a rare quality." Vaughn let out a short, incredulous breath, shaking his head. "Lady, you don't know who I am, or what I've done. You don't want my bloodline." "I know exactly who you are, Vaughn," she said, using his name for the first time. "I know you were a calm hand in a chaotic war. My name is Lien, and I have run out of time to be polite." She dismounted, her gray cheongsam brushing the snow. She stood tall, though she was a head shorter than him. "My family controls the trade routes from the coast to the mining camps. My father is old, and the council is pressuring me to marry a man named Chun. Chun is loud. He mistakes cruelty for strength. If I marry him, he will take what my family built and destroy it with his arrogance. I need a child to secure my claim as head of the family. But I will not bear a child to a man I despise." Vaughn looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the desperation hidden deep behind her stoic mask. He saw a woman cornered, fighting for her life in the only way she knew how. "So you rode up a mountain on Christmas Eve to find a stud horse?" "I rode up a mountain to find a man who understands that true power is stillness," Lien corrected. "I will return tomorrow. Think on it." She remounted with a fluid grace and turned her horse back toward the timberline. Vaughn watched her go, the gray of her dress disappearing into the white curtain of falling snow. He stood there long after she was gone, the absurdity of the request warring with a strange, dormant ache in his chest. He had spent years convinced that his blood was poison, that he was a dead end. Now, a woman in gray silk had looked him in the eye and told him his restraint was a virtue. Vaughn didn't sleep that night. The wind howled through the eaves, a blizzard settling in for the holiday. He sat by his wood stove, cleaning his revolver, the rhythmic motion usually a comfort, but tonight it felt insufficient. "I want an air from you." It was madness. But as he looked around his cabin, neat, solitary, and utterly empty, he realized the silence he had courted for so long had turned into a prison. The next morning, the world was buried. 2 feet of fresh snow had fallen. Vaughn spent the morning shoveling a path to the woodpile, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He told himself she wouldn't come back. The storm was too bad. The pass would be treacherous. But when he looked toward the treeline, she was there. Lien was covered in a layer of frost, her horse laboring through the drifts. Vaughn dropped his shovel and waded out to meet her, grabbing her horse's bridle to help pull the animal toward the shelter of the barn. "You're insane," he grunted, reaching up to help her down. Her hands were ice cold even through her gloves. "You could have frozen to death." "I said I would come back," Lien said, her teeth chattering slightly, though her posture remained rigid. "My word is iron." Vaughn led her into the cabin, the warmth of the stove hitting them like a physical wall. He poured her coffee from the pot on the stove, his movements stiff. He wasn't used to guests. He wasn't used to caring if someone else was warm. "Why me?" Vaughn asked again, watching her thaw out. "There are plenty of men who aren't killers." Lien wrapped her hands around the tin cup. "The men in town are weak. They are soft because they have never been tested, or they are hard because they are broken. You are neither. You have walked through the fire and carried the ash with you. Yet you do not smear it on others." She looked up at him, her dark eyes piercing. "My grandmother was a formidable woman. She taught me that the bamboo that bends in the wind survives, while the oak that refuses to bow snaps. Chun, the man they want me to marry, is an oak. He will snap and he will crush my family when he falls. You are like the bamboo." Vaughn leaned against the rough-hewn table. "I've been called a lot of things. Bamboo isn't one of them." "I have until the Lunar New Year," Lien said quietly. "If I am not with child or bound to a husband of my choosing, the council will force the marriage to Chun. They believe a woman cannot lead alone." "And what happens to me?" Vaughn asked. "I give you a child and then what?" "You disappear." "You could," she said, though her voice hesitated for the first time. "Or, you could stand beside me. My family needs a protector. Not a thug, but a guardian." Before Vaughn could answer, a sound from outside made him stiffen. It wasn't the wind. It was the heavy, rhythmic crunch of multiple horses. Vaughn moved to the window, peering through the frost. "3 riders," he said low in his throat. "Chinese. Heavy coats." Lien stood up, her face paling. "The council's men. They must have followed my tracks before the snow filled them in." Vaughn turned to her. "Stay here." "No," she moved to the door. "If I hide, I admit shame. I have nothing to be ashamed of." They stepped out onto the porch together. The 3 men had pulled up in the yard. They were heavily armed, their faces grim. The leader, an older man with a long, thin beard and eyes like flint, barked something in Cantonese. Lien answered, her voice sharp and defiant. The exchange was heated. Vaughn didn't need to speak the language to understand the tone. Accusation, disgust. The older man gestured at Vaughn, spitting a word that sounded like a curse. "He says you are a ghost of a man," Lien translated, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "He says you are a guilo with blood under his fingernails, unworthy to stand near me." "Tell him he's trespassing," Vaughn said calmly. One of the younger men, reckless and shivering in the cold, reached for the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Vaughn didn't draw. He didn't even shift his stance. He just looked at the young man. A look of such profound, bored lethargy that it was more terrifying than a scream. It was the look of a man who had seen death 1,000 times and wasn't impressed by it. The boy froze, his hand half wrapped around the rifle stock. The weight of Vaughn's stare was a physical thing, pressing down on the yard. "Don't," Vaughn said softly. The boy let go of the rifle. Lien stepped forward, placing herself between Vaughn and the riders. She spoke again, her voice lower this time, authoritative. She pointed to Vaughn, then to herself, then to the ground. Here. I stay here. The older man glared at her, then at Vaughn. He shook his head in disgust, barked a command, and turned his horse. The three riders retreated into the white haze. Lien let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for minutes. She turned to Vaughn, and he saw the tremor in her hands. They will tell the council, she whispered. They will tell Chen. Let them, Vaughn said. The protectiveness that flared in his chest surprised him. It wasn't just duty. It was admiration. She had stood up to them without a weapon, armed only with her conviction. Come inside. The storm's getting worse. That night, the blizzard truly unleashed itself. The cabin groaned under the assault. Around midnight, a sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. Vaughn was out of his bunk in a second, lantern in hand. The heavy snow was crushing the support beam of the lean-to where he kept the winter wood and the water barrels. If it went, it would take a section of the main roof with it. What is it? Lien asked, appearing from the guest cot, wrapped in a quilt. Roof beam. Snow's too heavy, Vaughn said, pulling on his boots. I have to clear it. It is death to go out there, she said, eyes wide. It's death to stay here if the roof collapses and lets the fire out, Vaughn countered. He grabbed a shovel and a coil of rope. He went out into the screaming wind. The cold was a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. He struggled up the ladder, the rungs slick with ice. The wind tried to tear him off the roof, but he stayed low, digging his boots into the shingles. He shoveled with a frantic rhythm, clearing the heavy drifts from the weakened section. Below him he saw a dim light. Lien was outside, holding the lantern high, shouting directions he couldn't hear over the wind, but her presence was an anchor. She wasn't cowering inside. She was spotting him. He worked until his muscles screamed and his face was numb. When he finally climbed down, half frozen, Lien was there to pull him inside. She stripped the frozen coat off him, her hands efficient and warm. They collapsed by the stove, shivering. You went up, she said, staring at him as the firelight danced on the walls. You could have died for a pile of wood. I went up because this is shelter, Vaughn rasped. You protect the home. Lien reached out, her fingers brushing the scar on his jaw. Chun would have sent a servant, and if the servant died, he would have bought another. You do the work yourself. The distance between them vanished. The cold outside made the warmth between them feel inevitable. Vaughn looked at this woman, this stranger in gray silk who had ridden into his purgatory and offered him a future, and he stopped fighting the ghost of who he used to be. He chose in that moment to be the man she saw. I'm not a bamboo, he whispered, but I can learn to bend. Then teach me, she said softly, and I will teach you that you are worthy of being a father. The days that followed the blizzard were a strange, suspended reality. They were snowed in, cut off from the world. Lien told him stories of the Pearl River, of her family's struggle to build a life in a land that hated them. Vaughn told her about the war, about the noise of the cannons, and why he craved the silence. They weren't just making an heir anymore. They were weaving two jagged lives into something whole. But the world outside didn't stop turning. On the day before New Year's, the snow had packed down hard enough to ride on. Vaughn was chopping wood when he saw them. 5 riders this time, and at the lead was a man who radiated violence. Chin. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat trimmed with bear fur. He didn't ride a settler's horse. He rode a massive black stallion. He dismounted in the yard with the arrogance of a king entering a conquered village. Lien rushed out of the cabin, her face pale. Chun, you have no right to be here. Chen ignored her. He walked straight toward Vaughn, stopping inches from him. Chun was younger, faster, and clearly eager for blood. He looked Vaughn up and down, sneering. So this is the Guilo stud, Chun said in perfect, accented English. He looks like a broken tool. Vaughn rested his axe against the chopping block. He didn't move his hands toward his gun. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides. You're trespassing, Chun. I am reclaiming what is mine, Chun spat. Lien is promised to me. You are nothing. A mountain hermit with a rusty gun. Chun stepped closer, invading Vaughn's personal space. He wanted a reaction. He wanted Vaughn to shove him, to draw, to start a fight that Chen's men would finish with the Winchesters they had leveled at the porch. Draw, Chen taunted. Show her you are a man. No, Vaughn said calmly. Chun laughed. A harsh, barking sound. Coward. Without warning, Chun threw a punch. It was fast, a martial artist strike, aimed right for Vaughn's temple. Vaughn saw it coming. His reflexes, honed by years of gunfighting, screamed at him to dodge, to block, to kill. But he remembered Lien's words. Strength isn't always loud. If he fought, he proved he was just another violent brute. If he fought, he jeopardized Lien's standing. Vaughn didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He held his ground, eyes locked on Chen's. The fist stopped a hair's breadth from his skin. The wind of the punch ruffled Vaughn's hair. Chen froze. He had expected the flinch. He had expected the fear or the aggression. He hadn't expected the absolute stillness of a mountain. Vaughn didn't blink. He just stared into Chen's eyes with a terrifying calmness. Are you done? Chun slowly lowered his hand, confusion warring with his anger. A man who didn't flinch at a death blow was a man who didn't fear death. And a man who didn't fear death was the most dangerous thing on earth. Lien stepped forward, her voice ringing out like a bell. You see, Chin? You use your hands. He uses his will. That is why he is the father of the next head of the family. And you are just a bully. Chun looked at Lien, then back at Vaughn. He saw the way Lien stood next to the gunslinger. Not behind him, but beside him. He saw the axe leaning against the block, and used. He saw a kind of power he didn't understand, but instinctively respected. The council will not accept a half-breed child, Chun sneered, though the conviction was gone from his voice. The council respects strength, Lien said, and I have found it. Chun held Vaughn's gaze for one last second, searching for a crack in the armor. Finding none, he spat on the snow, turned on his heel and signaled his men. We leave. Let the winter take them. As they rode away, Vaughn let out a long exhale, his knees feeling momentarily like water. Lien grabbed his hand, squeezing it so hard her knuckles turned white. You didn't move, she whispered, looking at him with awe. He could have killed you. He was testing me, Vaughn said, pulling her close. He needed to know if I was